I'm delighted to welcome back our dear friend, Dr. Gilbert. And Gilbert's been doing some amazing research of late up at Salford University, and we'll be covering all of that. But we're looking at the vulnerabilities that many of our community with FASD have to encounter on a daily basis. But something that, Gilbert, you mentioned to me that you were very particular about it, and very rightly so. It was a question around, well, it looks quite negative if we're just talking about the vulnerabilities. You were talking about empowerment as well. Can you explain to me why empowerment was so important as well as the vulnerabilities?
Well, thank you, Andrew, for having me again this evening, and permit me to say good evening and hello and welcome to all who have joined. Thank you for joining, and thank you for that question, Andrew. I think, first of all, I will say, while we were setting up this session, I think what really struck my mind and has really been all along, along the course of advance of my research is the respect I really have for individuals with FASD, the families, the kind of experiences they have had through different systems, especially the justice system. And that gives me a very, would I say, strong sense of consciousness when it comes to talking about the research that I do, in the sense that families, individuals have been through a lot already. And I certainly hate to be in the position of spreading news that looks a bit negative from the findings of my research. And one of the things I've really kind of tried to embed along the course of my work is to turn around the information, the kind of experimental evidence we are developing as a means of empowering the community. In the sense that what I mean by that is we know from some of the work I've been doing around suggestibility, confabulation, around distortion fabrications, and some of the complications that may be the outcome of encounters of individuals of FASD when it comes to justice system engagement. All of these vulnerabilities certainly can complicate issues, but it's about using that same information to kind of empower ourselves as a community such that our young people are aware, families are aware, and, from that stage on, use that as a foundation for intervention. So that's kind of the direction I'm taking with this. And that's why over our email conversation, I did mention to you that, well, it would be really good to make it really clear that that empowerment element is really crucial to discussions around vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And this is something that for anybody that has followed our webinar series over the last 3 years, you will know that we're always looking at striving to find positives. And also it for too many years, FASD has been surrounded by negativity, the stigma that's attached to it so often. And we're trying to come away from that and look at positive outcomes, because so frequently there are so many individuals within the FASD community that just scream positivity and have fantastic outcomes. So I thank you for drawing everyone's attention to that. Now, one of the clear and important factors here are individuals living with FASD face several vulnerabilities, including cognitive challenges, social risks, mental health issues, behavioral problems, educational barriers, and an array of other specific areas. So, Gilbert, you've been doing a series of research over the last year. Can you tell us, first of all, give us an overview of what your research was and why?
Right. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Starting off from the days of my PhD, where, it's not been so long I completed this. But my attention was very quickly drawn into the subject of the criminal justice system and individuals of FASD. This is following on from the research I conducted during my master's with social workers here in the UK, where we did realize that there was really a lot of lack of awareness when it comes to FASD, despite the fact that we know this population is very much overrepresented in the social services. Now, from that MSc research, I quickly, got, the real gist about the justice system, because it almost feels like a lot of times it's like a pipeline, isn't it? From
Mhm.
exclusion to school, social care services, then into the justice system. And I then set out to undertake a PhD in the area of FASD and the criminal justice system. And my interest was then really quickly honed down to areas around suggestibility, around compliance, around confabulation. Because at the time, and still now I'm quite interested in knowing what vulnerabilities, could first of all lead to behaviors that are relevant or of interest to the justice system, and then, when in engagement with the justice system, what are the factors that could complicate outcomes and lead to unfavorable outcomes? So, looking at these, two sets of conditions, suggestibility really was coming up strongly from parental testimonies, from testimonies of caregivers, because they did see how their young people were being easily manipulated. They would easily admit liability for crimes. But then I then quickly realized that experimental evidence in this area was really lacking. It was missing completely. Aside the work of Dr. Natalie and Paul Connor from the US, who I've been in contact with, and there's been nothing done. Their work was on 7 adults in the US in 2011. So I kind of used that work as a springboard to launch my PhD. And
Right.
with the PhD, I was privileged to work with 52 young people, and I managed to assess suggestibility experimentally. I assessed confabulation experimentally, and I was able to study the subject of compliance to see the difference between um, our young people who've had a diagnosis of FASD compared to a neurotypical control. And that study has now led to the current research I am doing, because out of that small study, I think the University of Salford here really were quite, they got really interested in the subject of FASD and the justice system. And
Mm.
they offered me a 5-year fellowship to focus and concentrate on these issues of suggestibility, confabulation, and compliance generally.
Now, during over the last week, we had Dr. Raja Mukherjee, your professor, and he was doing a Q&A with us down here in Kent, with many of the families and people within the sectors of the integrated care boards and various different areas. And your name came up. He spoke very highly of you, of the work that you're doing, particularly around this field. And it's when we're looking at suggestibility and confabulation, can you tell us precisely what it is, what suggestibility is, and what confabulation is, and then how it manifests itself in a particular scenario, let's say?
Right. Okay. Yes, I'm happy to shed light on these. There are a few constructs here which I'm interested in, and they really overlap. So firstly, suggestibility, as we know it, in terms of what I study, I mean, academically, we call it interrogative suggestibility, which kind of projects the fact that this is the kind of suggestibility that comes to play during a situation where an individual is being interviewed. Now, it's not just forensic interviews. This suggestibility we are also describing here can come to play during a social service interview, any interview situation whatsoever it is, where you are trying to extract a response or answers from an individual. Now, with interrogative suggestibility, we are talking about the tendency where an individual is very liable to accept suggestions in the context of interviewing. And there are certain factors involved that kind of produce these kind of responses. So there are certain conditions that, influence this. First of all, one thing we know theoretically from the suggestibility model is that there has to be high level of uncertainty. So the individuals you are in, the individual you are interviewing is really uncertain about, what the outcome is going to be. They are not sure of several factors. And then also we know that there has to be a high level of trust with, between you and that individual, because the individual, is not suspecting that you are interviewing them for a sinister motive. So they are really believing the suggestions you are putting across to them and assimilating it, incorporating it as part of their arguments. So, and then the third thing is there has to be also that level of anxiety also plays a part where there's high level of anxiety as well. It kind of influences these responses. That's suggestibility on its own. So is
Mm.
interview within a closed setting where you're trying to extract information about an event that has happened in the past. Now, the second construct that really looks very closely like suggestibility is what we know as compliance. It's also a psychological construct that leads to acceptance of suggestions, but with this, there's an element of social desirability. So the individual is just eager to please you, but essentially, internally, they've not accepted your suggestion. In the sense that they know that the answer. So if you are interviewing me, I know that, look, the suggestions Andrew is giving me, actually, I don't agree with them internally, but I'm just going to say yes just
Yeah.
because, I want to make him happy. I want to please him. So there's that element of internal, consciousness that, look, this is not real. But in suggestibility, the individual completely believes you. That's where the interpersonal trust comes in, where they think really you are interviewing them with pure motives and no sinister objectives behind. So compliance and suggestibility are really, they resemble each other closely, and there are a lot of overlaps. But when you look at the construct internally, you realize that with suggestibility, the individual completely says yes because they believe the suggestion you've put forward and they incorporate it as part of their belief system. But in compliance, that element of acceptance does not exist internally, but they just say yes. And many times that is related to ease of manipulation into criminal activity.
Yeah.
Know if that makes sense, but
It,
yeah,
it
compliance
absolutely
is
does.
yeah, compliance strongly links to ease of manipulation to criminal activities. And you can see that, and again, as we go along, I will be explaining that this is what I'm strongly interested in. I want to know,
Mm.
are our young people both suggestible and compliant, or are they just compliant? Because we see these differences in other neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD and autism. Previous research has shown that they are vulnerable in the context of the justice system, but theirs is very much aligned to compliance.
Now,
But yeah,
it's
sorry.
interesting. You brought up the fact that, I mean, with the spectrum being so vast, and we're looking at ADHD and autism as well, there is something about confabulation that is quite different, isn't there? That would you say confabulation is probably more likely to be geared towards the neurodisability of an individual with FASD more than somebody that has autism and ADHD as
Yeah,
a
so
diagnosis? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think at this level, especially from the previous study I conducted, um, I cannot conclusively say what the difference is between the two groups yet. But with the larger international study I'm currently conducting, I'm recruiting individuals with a diagnosis of FASD from 6 English-speaking countries, from the UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. This is one of the things we want to test.
Mm.
But just to give a bit of light in terms of what we know about current research is confabulation in itself is you can see it in different mental health conditions. So individuals with diagnosis of schizophrenia and many other mental health conditions can display confabulation. But then we want to tease out what the mechanisms are in the population with a diagnosis of FASD, because broadly speaking, we know confabulation can be provoked and unprovoked. Provoked meaning that the individual, in that context, has been suggested materials where they then implant into their memory. And I've seen it severally along the course of my research, where the false suggestions I present as part of my assessment, when I come back 7 days later and ask the young person as part of the assessment, tell me what happened last week, they then take my false suggestions, what I had proposed to them, and they admitted as reality in terms of suggestibility, they then incorporate it into their narration or their narrative. Unprovoked confabulation is complete fabrication, which has no kind of trace to suggestions being put forward. So these are some of the silent internal mechanisms we're trying to study a bit more, but certainly we've seen, in my experience, I've seen very, very remarkable confabulation in my assessment of individuals with FASD. And it is so, I mean, because the construct itself is a bit unstable in the sense that there are no dimensions, so to speak, mentally, it can happen just with anything at any point, anywhere, without any forewarning.
Can you give me an example of one of the questions? Let's say, let's go to suggestibility. One of the questions that you might ask an individual in your research. How would you go about doing that?
Right. If you don't mind, this will be a bit of storytelling too as well.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah,
what we're looking for.
thank you. So with my assessments, I employ a forensic tool known as the Gudgeonson Suggestibility Scale. It was developed by an emeritus professor in King's College London, Professor Gisley, who I'm in constant communication with. He's graciously been mentoring my work and has been guiding me. And we've been working also as well with Professor Raja, Professor Penny Cook, and Professor Claire on this. Now, with that tool, what happens is when the individual comes on any day, I will tell them a very short story, a brief story. The story is no more than 50 seconds long. And as soon as I finish, I then tell them immediately to recount the story back. Tell me all that you remember from what I've told you. Now, I take a record of their version of the story I just told them. And with that version, I'm able to assess, first of all, the strength of their memory. How many facts can they truly remember? I'm also able to assess what they've distorted. So distortion in this context is if they've changed minute details. If I tell them in the story it's a red bike and they tell me it's a black bike, essentially they've told me it's a bike, but they've swapped the colors around. That's distortion. But if they turn around to tell me it's a helicopter, that is complete fabrication. So it's different from distortion because the material elements of the story has been completely changed. They've introduced completely different facts to it. Now, I assess all of that as part of the first narrative they give me. I give them a 50 minutes break, so nearly an hour. We just do other things. We chat, we get to know each other because everything is remote. So the conditions are slightly milder than what a real interrogation situation would be. Now, as soon as we come back after the break, I then tell them, okay, tell me back that story I told you 50 minutes ago. So I get the second version. Now, with the second version, I then analyze again, what have they remembered? What have they distorted? What have they fabricated? What have they confabulated? As soon as we finish, I then ask them 20 questions, and this is all part of the forensic tool. By the way, this tool has been used in serious landmark cases here in the UK, Bingham 6, and because Professor Gisley did testify in those landmark cases where the convictions of people, life sentences were overturned because of his testimony.
Right, right.
So I asked them these 20 questions. 15 of these questions contain suggestions, subtle suggestions in them, and it is done on purpose. just to see if the individual will say yes to those suggestions. So, like you've asked, one of the questions would be, okay, originally the story is about a boy on a bike whose brakes were broken and he was asking for help because he was going down a steep slope. But then when I come to ask the questions, one of the questions would be something like, did the boy pass a stop sign or traffic light when he was screaming for help? Now, this question is known as a false alternative question because I'm presenting to them two suggestions just very in a very clandestine manner, very, just subtly, I'm telling them really there was a traffic light or a stop sign. So did the boy pass either of those? Meanwhile, the original story never contained anything like that. These questions mirror the same kind of questions real forensic interviewers may use. What this kind of a question does is it creates psychological pressure where the individual thinks one or both of these options must be correct. So they would either say, yes, the traffic light or the stop sign. And if they do that, they've just been suggestible immediately. Another question will be something like, did the boy drop the books he was carrying while riding the bike? Now that's an affirmative leading question. There were no books in the bike. You just ask that question with the assumption, you're kind of bringing an assumption that is established there were books in the story. Meanwhile, there were no books completely. And at that point, we want to see if the individual will say yes to those. So 15 of those 20 questions contain this kind of different leading questions where they may be applied in real life situations just to obtain confession. And that kind of gives us an idea. If this individual says yes to them, then we know there's suggestibility.
Now, there will be many families on this webinar tonight that will be fascinated by this because when you're living with somebody with FASD, you learn to read in between the lines on what the truth is, what suggestions there are. And also it's about many of the parents and carers will try or would have learnt not to throw in some suggestibility into the questions because, we know that so many of our young people want to please us. So I can see that your questioning there would absolutely throw in the question, well, yeah, they did answer this. They did do that. There were books in it because they want to please you in responding to it. Is that one of the reasons those questions are in place?
Yeah, certainly. I think I've not even finished the narration of what I do on that level, just to bring a bit of light to
Yes.
what you are saying now, Andrew. Once we finish the first round of 20 questions, I then say to them, there are a number of errors in the answers you've given me. Let's go over these questions one more time, try and be more accurate this time. Now, that feedback is certainly intended to increase some level of uncertainty, but it is also intended to somehow mirror the real life pressures you may receive in forensic interviews. Many times forensic interviews, you'll be told the story you've told me is all made up and tell me the truth. And there's that interrogative pressure being applied. In some countries, in some settings, um, forensic interviewers are even allowed to lie to interviewees to tell them, look, we have DNA evidence, we have CCTV evidence, your family know you committed this crime, so admit it, let's get on. We cannot go to that extent in my research. We just give that feedback, oh, there are errors, try and be more accurate. Now, once I give that feedback, I then ask those 20 questions again. The intention of re-asking at that point is to see if that feedback would make the individual begin to say yes to more of these suggestive questions, or will they begin to change their answers from no to yes? If they change from no to yes or yes to no, that element, that factor is known as shift. So they are shifting their answers because of the feedback, because they want to please, because they want to, look correct or give the correct answer to the interviewer. Now, with all of this, I'm able to then assess how suggestible this individual is. We repeat the same thing after 7 days. After 7 days, I ask them, come back again, tell me the story from last week. As soon as they tell me, I administer the same suggestive questions, tell them there's an error, re-administer the questions. Now, the idea is after 1 week, we want to see what time delay, memory delay does to confabulation. How does it impact distortion? How does it impact suggestibility? And then I can tell you at this point that yes, I've seen a lot of that, Andrew. I've seen a lot. I've seen complete opposite of answers as soon as you say there are errors in the answers you've given me. Um, the individual turns over where they've said yes all through. They begin to say no, 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 no.
Mm.
Other times I've seen where the individual takes the suggestions about the traffic light and the stop sign and incorporates it in the story 7 days later. I've
Yeah.
seen real wild dimensions of that story about a bike, on a boy on a bike going down a hill. I've seen versions coming back with witches in them, with dogs barking, with children fighting, real extensive confabulation. And finally, again, relating to the question you've asked, I've also seen where individuals will say yes to the suggestions that were false, they will admit them, but then go as far as developing imaginary stories to buttress their answers.
Right.
Now, in forensic context, this is real self-incrimination. When I shared the results with Gisli Godjensen, he was absolutely shocked because he's worked with intellectual disability population. He's worked with populations with diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And he said to me, look, Gilbert, I have never seen this dimension before. Because not only is this person saying yes, but then he's developing premises, developing argument, developing imaginary stories to buttress why they think their answers is right.
And I think this is why your research is so vital for the data, because you and I have been working together for some time on projects around FASD within the criminal justice system. And the one thing that we see, we just recently had a meeting where we brought in some lawyers talking about the impact within the legal side of it and the miscarriages of justice. When you see this to be the case, you can imagine just how many miscarriages of justice have happened, because we know for a fact, I've spoken about it online here and in our training as well, that there are periods within the development of anybody going throughout their development, from school to through puberty, and then transitioning it from child services into adult services. There's this cliff edge that we talk about where services and that wraparound network of support disappears, and they go into a wilderness so frequently where the services are not supporting them and their vulnerabilities are in place. And we see cases of many young people where they get involved in the criminal justice system. They're targeted by gangs. Down here in the southeast, we've got a lot involved with county lines. Now, you can imagine that your research and your information that you're picking up at the moment, just your findings, you can see those individuals being so vulnerable in that area, can't you?
Yes, certainly, Andrew. And I think this is where the idea of converting what the experimental data is showing us to a tool for empowerment. And in terms of empowerment, I'm talking internally as a community for our young people, for our families, because yes, we are spreading the word with professionals. We are spreading the word with, we've just recently trained Crown Court judges. We've trained magistrates, nearly 80 of them. And we've trained court professionals here in Manchester. We're working with probation. But you and I know that many times, because of the way systems are structured, it could take quite a while for these changes to happen.
Mm.
And my thought is, we can internally convert this information from experimental data in a fashion that can empower ourselves, empower young people, and empower families to know how to navigate these vulnerabilities, such that these issues of miscarriage of justice, we can just find a way around it. Because sitting down as a researcher and seeing what the results tell, what the data tell,
Mm,
absolutely. I have goosebumps anytime I think of what they can translate to in real life. Because, like I said at the onset, all my assessments are remote in the sense that parents, caregivers can sit with the individual to offer support where necessary. Anxiety levels are low. Interrogative pressure is nowhere near what the real life situation is. And then you see this massive suggestibility results. You
mm.
see this massive confabulation. You see massive distortion and fabrication. And yeah, you just think, oh my God, in
Yeah.
real life settings, this is, going to be absolute disaster.
Well, I know when we talk to some of our young adults that have got FASD that are advocates around the world, they talk about this fight or flight mode and how they internalize those moments, and frequently they'll sort of just want to bat everybody away, so they'll say whatever comes into their mind. I was uh, one of our support groups recently. One of the carers said that her young man was involved in your research and your studies,
Right,
and she was sitting um, in the corner listening and observing, um, with safeguarding measures and what have you. And she said, I know my young man. I know my young man very well. We've had a long journey together over the years.
right.
She said, and yet I was so shocked at the levels of suggestibility through your studies. I was so shocked at the confabulation, that the stories that he was coming up with, or his interpretation of those stories. Now, I think one of the other great values of your research here is that it can really teach us how to communicate more effectively with those individuals. I mentioned the Q&A that we had with Raja the other day, and
Yeah,
one of the social workers was saying about the challenges they have in communicating with the
yeah,
person trying to get the information back
yeah,
on a story that might have happened.
yeah,
And we brought up your study talking about, she was asking questions, and I was saying or suggesting that alongside Raja, that it's about the questions and the way that those questions are being asked. If you put in just something, any idea of what might have happened, you're going to get a very different story, rather than just leaving it to their suggestions. Is this something that you're finding as well?
yes, certainly. With especially based on the data, which from the smaller study and what I'm currently doing, we are really seeing the importance of modifying questions. It keeps coming up over and over again, because certainly you see once the suggestion goes out, you just get a yes, yes, yes. And unfortunately, with all due respect, you see that this kind of interrogation technique is very, very prevalent around the world
Yes.
because the justice system, and I am not saying confessions don't help to resolve crimes. They do. They are massively important. But the system is set up in such a way that, it's all about obtaining that confession, extracting that confession.
Mm.
And such questions will be thrown out with suggestions, with these initial assumptions, and with our young people, with these vulnerabilities, it becomes a massive trap where the answer the forensic interviewer wants to hear is what is exactly given. And this is where I think we think working alongside these families has been quite, even for myself as a researcher, I see the value in working alongside to empower ourselves with what the data is saying. So for instance, one of the things we do is for every participant, we generate reports of their performance and hand over to the families as hopefully a tool for advocacy. It's not a diagnostic report, but it's a research report that says we've worked with this young person. These are the vulnerabilities we've seen. And if you're a professional working with this young person, please be aware of this. This is what it translates to in real life. And honestly, I've also seen good news stories that kind of really motivates me to say, look, if there is increased understanding on the part of professionals and even families of these vulnerabilities and what is going on, it can really produce good outcomes. 2 weeks ago, I was in Scotland with Raja, where I delivered a keynote speech, and I met for the first time some of the families I'd worked with for the last 2, 3 years. And one of them was particularly so inspiring in the sense that she's never been in contact with the justice system, and there are several others who've never been in contact with the justice system because of the support and understanding that has been kind of built around at the family level. So hopefully that's the kind of empowerment we are hoping the research data we are getting can, help families achieve.
Absolutely. One of the interesting points here, I'm just looking at some of the questions. How would, what sort of tips and ideas would you look at? This is from David Jerry, about ideas on empowerment once we have this information.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, I think we have to work with the families and then our young people in the sense that when we understand the mechanism that provokes confabulation, when we deeply understand the relationship between confabulation, suggestibility, interrogative pressure, suggestive questioning, and we see kind of the relationship that goes on and prediction of one from the other, it provides us a platform to then begin to think of interventions that may be useful to families, and the young people themselves. And one of these certainly would be, in terms of in terms of suggestibility, would be questions modifications as we've seen so far. And then at the family level, we're hoping that the data can give us more insight into proposing what ways, or what interventions can be administered to support young people, especially as they go out and engage with professionals, as they go out to engage with, society generally. So hopefully we get to that point. That's what this second study I'm conducting is all about. We really want to study in depth to see the mechanism, what is going on, what do we know about the relationship between compliance and acquiescence. Acquiescence is also another vulnerability I study, which really, can also be quite implicating within the justice system.
I've got another question that's come up here, and we're talking here about capacity as well. And we know that many individuals with FASD will have fluctuating capacity. Can you explain a little bit about, and if this has become part of the research or part of that, the questioning that you have?
Yes, this is another serious one, Andrew,
Yeah.
fluctuating capacity. It very much strongly or has relationship with what we also know as the frontal lobe paradox, where individuals during psychological assessments could perform well, but in real life they will struggle. And the reason clearly is in assessment conditions, they are quite regulated conditions where everything is, ordered, but in real life situation, everything can be thrown all at once at you, everything can come at you all at once. And this is where the struggle becomes really evident that, yes, though the results are this, and this is why many times again in the work I do, I see our young people with good results in terms of IQ assessment. You could see good IQs, you could see high IQs, but then when you then look at the suggestibility score, look at the confabulation score, some may even really present with memory recall that is above average, but then these other vulnerabilities are just really, up and above, or they're just out the window. So one of the things in terms of fluctuating capacity and frontal lobe paradox is, and we do advocate, even in some of the publications I have had, that parental testimony, caregiver testimonies should never be neglected, as is the practice many times. Professionals seem to neglect this. And I mean, respectfully, I say it to me, it really it feels counterintuitive, because the individual you are dealing with, the best person who knows them is the caregiver, is the parent.
Mhm.
They live with them every day. No one else knows them better than they are. And if you neglect their testimony, neglect what they are saying, then we are certainly on the path to miscarriage of justice. So I'm really interested in that, in frontal lobe paradox. And one of the things I have incorporated into the research is trying to assess what we now know as memory distrust syndrome, which is again closely linked to this, because in memory distrust syndrome, this individual knows he or she, they have very poor memory. They can't trust their memory, they distrust their memory. So they are looking out to you for body cues, body language or facial cues to respond to you. And then that then becomes disaster for them. So yes, certainly these are the things I am looking at currently.
Uh, Another really important question, theoretical question, that you were talking about previously when we've had discussions, was how trauma and adverse childhood experience ACEs may impact suggestibility and confabulation. I think this is a very interesting subject. Can you deep dive into that a little bit more?
Yes, certainly. Again, there seems to be so much at the moment. I'm trying to really maximize this 5-year fellowship and,
Yes.
study as much as I can, because I feel it's a big blessing that's kind of come my way in a subject I'm really passionate about. So with trauma, again, I've included that into the mix. I'm assessing adverse childhood experiences. I'm assessing trauma. I'm assessing how that impacts suggestibility, confabulation, how that impacts the other vulnerabilities, compliance, acquiescence. And I'm keen to see what that looks like. And this is because in the wider literature, we know that people who've been traumatized from childhood, who've experienced trauma, they are very suggestible. And there's been studies on, for instance, children who've been sexually abused. There have been studies on people who've been through the asylum system applying for asylum, and their
Mm.
suggestibility scores have always consistently been above that of, the neurotypical population. So I'm keen to see what it will look like in this bigger study, because then we can start teasing out again interventions and kind of awareness packages that may support the population. With these studies, one of the things again that I see have been quite a loophole is the fact that the studies in themselves have given us insight that trauma can lead to suggestibility, but they never looked at prenatal alcohol exposure. They never
Right.
looked at, the confounding factor of alcohol. They looked at trauma, they looked at suggestibility, they looked at child sexual abuse, but then they never controlled for alcohol exposure. So hopefully, we can get better insights when we are done with this.
A good friend of ours, Jeff Dunbar, he's written the question. In our discussions, we've found that liaison and diversion that's a group of support network, can play a key role when our loved ones get caught up in the criminal justice system. As I understand, if the police can initiate their involvement very early on, it feels as if the service is somewhat hidden, but can be mentioned so that more people are aware of the service. So understanding those that are already caught up in the criminal justice system, we are being advised that there is a liaison and diversion team that are there to help. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because those individuals will need to be upskilled, won't they, in exactly what you're dealing with here about managing as somebody comes into the criminal justice system, or
Yeah.
if they're already within the criminal justice system, they can access this support, can't they?
Yes, certainly. L&D is so crucial when it comes to helping vulnerable individuals avoid, just going through what we know as the justice system and the way it is set up currently. And I do agree with Jeff. I agree completely that this service is so important in the sense that they need to know about FASD. They really need to know about FASD because it reminds me of the subject of appropriate adults when it comes to our young people who are minors under 18 coming through the justice system. And one of the things I always say, I think it's almost become like a song I sing every time. I always ask the question, how appropriate is the appropriate adult?
Yes.
Because if the adult sat there as the appropriate adult is not aware of the vulnerabilities of FASD, cannot spot these signs, then it is almost like a wasted effort. So again, like L&D as well, I think it really applies to them because it's so important. It's so important that diversion service is so crucial. And I know sometimes I sit and speak to families and I tell you some of the things I hear, you hardly can go and have a good night's sleep
Mm,
because you hear families saying, look, all we are living for is to make sure this young person doesn't end up in the justice system. That's all we are living for.
mm,
I I mean, and I know they are not, they are happy for me to share this. I've taken their permission. I had one recently tell me that, look, I rather this boy is killed than taken into prison because I know he's not going to survive it. And that diversion service is so crucial because with this system is set up with the ambition of rehabilitating people, but if FSD awareness is not embedded in all the interventional approaches, then when the individual is released, you are releasing a more damaged person rather than doing any good. And this is not good for anybody, not good for the young person, not good for the families, not good for society, not good for the taxpayers, not good for the system generally.
and we've dealt with, we support so many families where we've referred to it as a revolving door frequently because that seems to be their safe place going back into a prison situation. But we want to look at positivity. We want to turn this into a positive and empowering subject as well, and hence your research. Now, you mentioned about your international research. You've looked at it internationally. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you and I have spoken about this at length, that Canada is leading the way or has been leading the way for some years with their courts. They have an FASD specific court. They have an understanding, much greater understanding within their legal system. And it's not that different to our own. So can you explain the work that Canada have been doing over the years that we could emulate?
Yes, certainly. I think we have quite, especially within the criminal justice system, there are quite a number of things that we can learn and adapt to our own setting here, like you rightly mentioned. The FASD courts is certainly one very special provision that is just so fantastic, in my opinion, because then you are really targeting what we know as compassionate justice. You are looking at the individual and really understanding circumstances that, have led them to where they are. And in the light of the diagnosis, the professionals involved in this court process understand, that, look, we are dealing with a condition that, these are the vulnerabilities. And then the sentencing reflects that.
Mm,
The I mean, procedural justice at that point also reflects that. The accommodations reflect that understanding, and it's just so crucial, you know, to kind of look at what is happening in these settings and see if we can apply them over here in the UK. And again, one thing I also find out, what I found is the information, the level of awareness certainly has been, I think we've had so much work done with professionals, especially judges and
Mm.
those who sit to take decisions, policy makers, which again can be such a positive influence to what the outcomes could be for the young people. I was in the US. I was invited alongside a few other judges and forensic experts from other parts of the world where we visited a tribal court. And I thought again that this is now not Canada but the US.
Yeah.
And sitting in that court, Andrew, I saw so much that could be transferable to, individuals of FASD. And we know again that within Aboriginal populations, exposure to alcohol is quite a big thing. So
Mm.
sitting in that court, I mean, I just imagine that probably a number of these young people that are coming through the court, witnessing the procedures, in my head, I was saying, well, there will be some who have undiagnosed FASD. But the point is, the approach to justice sitting in those courts or sitting in that court, was just so phenomenal. Just accommodations that, you can clearly see that speak to the subject of compassion and justice.
Mm.
Just, I mean, Andrew, just even sitting arrangement. Normally in our English courts, we have the judge sitting right above everybody, but
Mm.
then something as simple as having the judge just sitting at the level of everybody, it was amazing to see. It was.
Yeah.
So I think these things that it just speaks to what increased level of awareness can do in the administration of justice is administered, don't get me wrong, but then
Yes.
you're administering it in a manner that is person-centered, is
Yeah.
FASD informed, the intervention reflects that. And I think,
Absolutely. We've got Anna from New Zealand. Hi, Anna. Lovely to see you from FASD New Zealand. And she was saying, the same situation in their judicial system as well. Your research, are you still looking for case studies to take part in your research? Do you still need people for your cases to continue the research over the next 5 years?
yes, Andrew, certainly. I think somehow in science it's almost like a game of numbers, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The more numbers you get, the more you can arrive at very strong conclusions. So yes, we are hopeful that we can get more families to contribute. And like I always say, we always remain grateful to families who have taken their time to volunteer so far. And no matter how passionate I am about this, if families don't turn off, then nothing happens. So yes,
And this is, I'm a real advocate. I was saying it again with Raja the other day. I'm a real advocate in saying to families, this is something that you actually can do. You can do to help the next generation. At the moment, it's not immediate. We can't do things right this minute, but what we can do is change things for the future.
yeah.
And with the struggles that many of our families have faced over the years, this is a really important study. And they can get hold of you, can they, through through your email at Salford University? Is that the best way of communicating with you?
Yes, certainly. We've also got the links for families who may want to register directly. There's a link, and I wonder what the best way is to.
Well, how about because we'll be loading this up. We've got a question on here as well that's asking, will other people be able to see this? On our YouTube channel, we hold all our previous webinars. There's a previous webinar with Gilbert from, I think, about 2 years ago now. So while you were doing your PhD study, and we'll include that link in the description for that webinar, and we'll probably have that up within the week. So please do take the time to look at that. And can I stress as well, it's really important that people realize you don't have to be within the criminal justice system or even anywhere along the criminal justice. The research that you're doing is simply looking at suggestibility and confabulation. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I know many times when it's advertised as FSD and justice system, a lot of families think you have to have had an encounter with the police or the justice system. No, it's just a diagnosis of FSD. Once the individual is 11 or above, it's perfectly fine. And all we're trying to do, like you mentioned, Andrew, is just wanting to see the diagnosis of FASD, what are the vulnerabilities we can pick up from this research that will provide data to kind of give an indication of what the best approaches will be to prevent self-incrimination and miscarriage of justice.
And we know that this data, this research will be a centerpiece for everywhere around the world to be able to give people an understanding of the vulnerabilities within the FASD community, but also to be able to understand how to communicate more effectively with our people. Gilbert, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the work that you are doing for the FASD community. You're a much loved friend of the FASD community and will long be that, I'm sure.
Thank you, Andrew. And I must also seize the opportunity to also appreciate the families, the young people who have taken their time. Also, I have a company of nearly about 18 experts around the world who are collaborating on this research from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, US, and it's phenomenal to see the unity on this front. These experts have been in the field long before I came, but you can see how there's so much harmony on this, and the organizations too who have provided voice to this and worked with us. I think it's just a family, and I'm grateful for that. I consider it a privilege and honor to do anything at all if it will make a difference.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us tonight as well on this fascinating webinar. As I said, if you want to view any of our previous webinars, we've got about 30 odd webinars, all with some of the leading lights in the FASD community. It's there to educate, to help us understand better the FASD community that we support. So please do join us on that. In the meantime, thank you so much. We're going to be having a break over the Christmas, and we'll be back in the new year with some more fantastic guests. So until then, thank you so much. Gilbert, thank you once again. And I'll see you very soon. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.